Hello and welcome back to the Jerusalem Post. I'm your host, Tamar Uriel-Beeri, and I'm joined today by Liora Rez. Liora is the Executive Director of StopAntisemitism, a grassroots watchdog organization dedicated to exposing groups and individuals that espouse incitement towards the Jewish people and the state of Israel and engage in anti-Semitic behaviors. Liora, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Liora, do you believe that the efforts to combat anti-Semitism occur top down or bottom up? In other words, who does it really start with? The leaders in politics or on social media, or the people in person among friends and loved ones?
That's a wonderful question. And honestly, it starts with all of us. Instead of a vertical responsibility hierarchy, it's more of a horizontal one. Everyone from our congressional leaders to our execs in the social media tech world, to our community leaders, to just our friends and community members. We're all responsible for fighting and saying no to anti-Semitism.
So, how would you explain the reasoning, however twisted it is, behind the anti-Semitism ignited by the war that broke out on October 7th? It's kind of confusing, isn't it? A wave of anti-Semitism launched after terrorists killed a lot of Israelis, the majority of them Jews.
Right. So every single time we see anything happen in Israel, we see a wave of anti-Semitism just spark and spread like stage 4 cancer in the globe. 10/7 was not only different, but honestly, it completely opened up the sewer of anti-Semitism that we were seeing and ripped the Band-Aid essentially off and opened the gate for bigots to just espouse their hatred at every and any turn.
I see. Can you try to get into the minds of those who express hatred of Jews? Try to explain how their thinking works? I mean, know thy enemy, right?
So some of these individuals just have this deep-rooted intrinsic hatred of the Jewish people, and any excuse that they can to propagate this hate, they use. This is a perfect example of it. What happened on October 7th, this was a massacre. Over 1,000 Jews were murdered. We saw mass rapes. We saw Holocaust survivors murdered and kidnapped. We saw babies murdered. It's some of the worst atrocities that we've seen since the Holocaust. And rather than sympathizing with the victim, the Jewish people, we see these anti-Semites actually blaming Jews and using this as an excuse to propagate even more hatred. And the only thing that we can honestly say is that they needed an excuse to propagate more hatred against the Jewish people. And circumstances like this, they use it and green light their hatred.
Anti-Semitism here is not sparked by anti-Zionism, but rather anti-Zionism is a cover for anti-Semitism.
100%. The majority of these individuals who are espousing this hatred, screaming, down with Zionism, yada yada, they don't even understand the word of the definition. They don't understand that it's just simply the self-determination of the Jewish people. When they're screaming from the river to the sea, they have no idea what river and what sea. It's just ridiculous catchphrases that they've been taught. And some of them are ignorant. Yes, it comes from a place of ignorance, but the majority of them are just it's this intrinsic hatred as they keep repeating them. This is just an excuse for them to propagate their hatred. Again, green lighting their hatred towards the Jewish people.
Anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is not something new that diaspora Jews experience, but are these facets of this form of hate that were not prevalent prior to the war. So they've suddenly risen to the surface.
So the levels of anti-Semitism, specifically the segments that we're seeing it come from, is startling. Everyday community members, physicians, lawyers, some friends or community members we considered as friends. This is where this horrific hatred is coming from. And it's very reminiscent of 1939 Germany. We all knew who the Nazis were, but when we're looking at our friends and community members next to us in Lithuania, in Poland, in former Yugoslavia, these are everyday neighbors and friends of ours who turn their backs. And this is exactly what we're seeing right now happen. And it's extremely frightening.
Right. So turning towards the campaigns that Stop Antisemitism leads to combat this, tell us a little bit about the Stop Don't Shop campaign in response to the rise of antisemitism we're seeing.
Yeah. So one of the phenomenons that we actually did see and started seeing since the October 7th is not only individuals espouse bigotry against the Jewish people and nation, but now businesses. So dozens of individuals, if not hundreds, were coming to us saying, we want to know where we should be spending our hard-earned money and what places of business we should be staying away from. So we launched a new initiative of Stop Antisemitism, Stop Don't Shop, and it highlights businesses that propagate hatred against the Jewish people and nation. And on the flip side, also places of business that support the Jewish people and nation.
So what are some communities that you've seen perhaps a surprising surge in antisemitism, one that you wouldn't expect necessarily?
So one of the most startling segments that we've seen is the medical profession, to be honest. Surgeons, pediatricians, oncologists, nurses, medical scribes. These individuals, during their daytime hours, they treat Jewish patients. They work alongside their Jewish coworkers. And then they go home and on social media post some of the most vile anti-Semitic content we've seen, from referring to Hamas terrorists as freedom fighters, justifying or denying the October 7th massacre, denying mass rapes happened. It's honestly, it's so frightening. So what Stop Antisemitism does is alert and expose to the community, their employers, their patients, who exactly these people are. Because when you're in a situation with a medical professional that you're entrusting with your care, you're in a vulnerable position. And an individual who takes the Hippocratic oath to treat patients, regardless of ethnicity, religion, sex, ethnicity, and then goes home and propagates such hate on public forums is unacceptable.
Right. The fear is that ultimately they will not stand by the Hippocratic Oath, that there will be a bias in their treatment.
Correct, whether conscious or subconscious. It's honestly frightening, the content that we see coming from these professionals. But it's not only the medical professionals. We've seen attorneys, we've seen kindergarten teachers, we've seen college professors, which is an ongoing issue.
Wow.
We've seen professionals from the finance industry. It's absolutely everywhere, and it's honestly extremely alarming.
Liora Rez, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you so much for having me.